On the morning of July 23, 1942, in a quiet bedroom within a Parisian mansion on the Rue de la Paix, a man took his final breath as summer light filtered through silk curtains that had witnessed 3 decades of triumph and transformation. Louis Cartier, master jeweler to kings and maharajas, architect of the world's most prestigious luxury brand, died at age 66 in the same measured, elegant manner he had lived. His passing as refined and understated as the platinum settings he had revolutionized, as precise as the mystery clocks he had perfected, as permanent as the diamonds he had set into the crowns of empires. He had been failing for months, his legendary vitality dimmed by illness that no fortune could cure, his once sharp mind still cataloging designs even as his body surrendered. His devoted wife Jacqueline sat beside him in those final hours, holding the hand that had once sketched the world's most coveted jewels, that had shaken hands with Edward VII and Alfonso III, that had placed the Hope Diamond into its current setting, that had transformed 3 small jewelry workshops into a global empire valued in the millions. The doctors had prepared the family for this moment, but preparation does little to soften the reality of loss when it arrives on a summer morning in occupied Paris. The mansion itself stood as testament to everything Louis Cartier had achieved across 40 years of relentless creativity and commercial genius. Located at 13 Rue de la Paix, steps from the Place Vendôme where Napoleon's column rose against the Parisian sky, the building represented not just wealth, but taste. Its facade whispered of Belle Epoque elegance, its interior showcased Art Deco innovation. Its workshops hummed with craftsmen executing designs that would adorn the necks and wrists and fingers of everyone who mattered in European society and beyond. From Russian Grand Duchesses to American railroad heiresses, from Indian princes to South American mining magnates.
But on this morning in July 1942, as Louis Cartier's chest rose and fell for the final time, as his wife's tears fell onto hands that would create no more beauty, as his family gathered to witness the end of an era, the mansion seemed to exhale with him, to acknowledge that something irreplaceable was slipping away, that the man who had built this empire through vision and perfectionism and countless personal sacrifices was leaving behind a legacy that would bear his name for generations, but would never again know his touch, his judgment, his singular ability to see beauty where others saw only stones and metal, to create desire where others saw only commerce. What Louis Cartier could not know as death claimed him was that the mansion he loved, the brand he built, the family business he elevated to unprecedented heights would survive him by decades and centuries. He could not know that the Cartier name would become even more valuable after his death than during his lifetime, that his innovations in jewelry design would influence generations of craftsmen, that the empire he created would expand to continents he never visited, to markets he never imagined. He died believing he had secured his legacy, that his work would endure, that the sacrifices he made, personal happiness subordinated to professional excellence, health compromised by endless work, private life consumed by public responsibilities, had been worthwhile investments in permanence. He was right about the legacy, but he was wrong about the cost. And the mansion that witnessed his final breath holds secrets about that cost, whispers truths about the price of perfection, remembers sacrifices that the Cartier brand history prefers to forget. But to understand how death came to this palace of beauty, how illness found the man who had everything except time to enjoy it, how the creator of the world's most famous luxury brand spent his final years not in celebration but in shadow, we must travel back to a different Paris, a humbler address, a young man with ambition burning like fire in a workshop where diamonds first revealed their possibilities to eyes trained to see not what was, but what could be. Humble beginnings. The story of Louis Cartier's mansion begins not with the glittering Rue de la Paix address that would define his mature years, but with a small jewelry workshop at 29 Rue Montorgueil in the 2nd arrondissement of Paris, where on September 6, 1875, a boy was born into a family already committed to the craft of transforming precious metals and stones into objects of desire. Louis-Joseph Cartier entered a world where his surname already carried weight in Parisian jewelry circles, where his grandfather had established a reputation for quality craftsmanship, where his father Alfred was building upon that foundation, with designs that caught the attention of Paris's expanding bourgeoisie and surviving aristocracy in the early years of the Third Republic. The Paris of Louis's childhood was a city rebuilding itself after the trauma of the Franco-Prussian War and the Paris Commune. A city where Haussmann's boulevards provided elegant arteries through which flowed new money from industry and finance. A city where the wounds of 1870-71 were healing beneath layers of guilt and gaslight, and the determination to prove that French culture remained supreme despite military defeat. Into this atmosphere of defiant beauty and commercial opportunity, Louis Cartier grew up breathing the air of jewelry workshops, where the smell of solder and polish mixed with expensive perfumes when clients visited, where conversations alternated between technical discussions of setting techniques and social gossip about who was wearing what to which ball or reception. His father, Alfred Cartier, had taken over the family business from Louis-François Cartier in 1874, just a year before Louis's birth, purchasing the workshop and its goodwill for 20,000 francs at a time when such a sum represented both substantial capital and a calculated gamble on the future of luxury goods, in a France determined to forget its recent humiliations in the glow of economic expansion and cultural achievement. Alfred was a capable craftsman, but more importantly, a shrewd businessman, who understood that jewelry was not merely about creating beautiful objects, but about understanding the desires and insecurities and social ambitions of the women and men who purchased those objects, about recognizing that a diamond necklace was never just a necklace, but a statement of status, a claim to belonging, a weapon in the endless warfare of Parisian society. Young Louis absorbed these lessons not through formal instruction, but through observation, through watching his father navigate the delicate balance between artistic integrity and commercial necessity, through seeing how Alfred would adjust his recommendations based on whether the client entering the shop was old aristocracy clinging to inherited taste or new money, eager to purchase validation along with gemstones. The boy showed early aptitude for the family trade, demonstrating not just mechanical skill with tools and materials, but something rarer and more valuable, an instinctive understanding of proportion and harmony, an eye that could see how a particular stone should be set to maximize its beauty, how a design should be simplified to achieve elegance rather than cluttered to demonstrate expense. His education followed the pattern typical for sons of successful artists and merchants in late 19th century Paris: solid grounding in mathematics and languages, apprenticeship in the family workshop beginning at age 13, exposure to art through visits to museums and galleries, where he studied not just jewelry and historical portraits, but the broader principles of design and composition. Louis learned that the best jewelry designers understood painting and sculpture, understood architecture and furniture, understood that all decorative art spoke a common language of line and form, and the relationship between mass and void, between ornament and restraint. But while his technical education progressed, Louis also received instruction in the social aspects of the luxury trade, accompanying his father to the homes of wealthy clients, where he observed how Alfred would carefully gauge the emotional temperature of a marriage before suggesting whether a significant jewelry purchase should be presented as investment or romance, how he would adjust his pitch based on whether the client's fortune came from inherited estates or recent speculation, how he would delicately navigate the politics of mistresses and second wives who required jewels that announced their status without explicitly challenging the primacy of the legitimate family. These years between 1888 and 1895, when Louis transitioned from boy to young man, from student to craftsman, from observer to participant in the family business, were marked by transformation, not just in his personal development, but in the broader world of Parisian luxury commerce. The 1889 Exposition Universelle had showcased French decorative arts to the world, had brought wealthy visitors from America and Russia and South America to Paris, where they discovered that French jewelers could create objects that combined technical mastery with artistic vision, that could transform wealth into beauty in ways that jewelers in London or New York or St. Petersburg could not match. Louis witnessed the impact of this growing international clientele on his father's business, saw the workshop expand from a handful of craftsmen to nearly 24, saw the client book grow to include not just Parisian families, but visiting Maharajas and American heiresses and Russian Grand Dukes who sought French luxury. With the same determination, they sought French champagne and French perfume and French mistresses. He learned that the jewelry business was not merely local or even national, but increasingly global. That a design created in Paris might end up adorning a bride in Buenos Aires or celebrating a business triumph in New York. That the Cartier name was becoming known beyond the boundaries of France. By 1895, when Louis turned 20, he had become indispensable to his father's operations, had demonstrated abilities that extended beyond craftsmanship into design innovation and client relations, had shown the combination of artistic vision and commercial instinct that marks the difference between competent jewelers and those who define their era. He had discovered within himself a restless creativity that chafed against traditional jewelry conventions, that wondered why necklaces had to follow established patterns, why bracelets couldn't incorporate new materials, why jewelry design seemed frozen in historical revival styles, when the other decorative arts were beginning to experiment with new forms. But 1895 brought changes that would accelerate Louis's trajectory from promising craftsman to revolutionary designer. In that year, Alfred Cartier made a decision that would transform the family business from successful workshop into legendary house. He moved the firm's premises to 13 Rue de la Paix, the street that was rapidly becoming the address for Paris's most prestigious jewelers, where proximity to the place Vendôme brought not just prestige, but access to the wealthiest international clientele who stayed at the Ritz Hotel and shopped at the most exclusive establishments. The move required substantial capital, demanded confidence in future growth, represented a gamble that the Cartier name could compete with longer-established houses like Boucheron and Chaumont, who already occupied Rue de la Paix addresses. For young Louis, the move represented both opportunity and pressure. Opportunity to escape the constraints of the Montorgueil workshop, where tradition weighed heavy. Pressure to prove that his designs could attract and retain the caliber of clientele that justified the expensive new premises. He responded to this challenge by throwing himself into design experimentation, by studying the emerging Art Nouveau movement that was transforming decorative arts across Europe, by examining historical jewelry from the Renaissance and ancient Egypt and the Orient for ideas that could be adapted to modern tastes, by beginning to develop the design philosophy that would eventually revolutionize luxury jewelry. The transformation from Montorgueil to Rue de la Paix, from neighborhood craftsman to international jeweler, from traditional designs to innovative vision occurred during these formative years, when Louis Cartier was finding his voice, developing his eye, preparing for the moment when his father would hand him control, and he would have opportunity to implement ideas that currently lived only in sketchbooks and imagination. He was learning that success in the jewelry business required understanding not just gemstones and metalwork, but psychology and society, art and commerce, tradition and innovation. But he was also learning something darker, something that would shadow his entire career, that excellence demands sacrifice, that building an empire requires subordinating personal desires to professional necessities, that the man who would become Louis Cartier, master jeweler, would have to compromise or abandon aspects of Louis Joseph Cartier, private individual. The mansion would be built. The empire would rise. The Cartier name would become legendary. But the cost would be calculated not in francs or time, but in health and happiness, and the quiet moments of peace that elude men who chase perfection. By the dawn of the 20th century, as Paris prepared for the 1900 Exposition Universelle that would announce the Belle Époque in full flower, Louis Cartier stood ready to claim his inheritance and exceed his father's achievements, ready to transform the Cartier name from respected to legendary, ready to pay whatever price success demanded. Empire rising by 1899, Louis Cartier had evolved from talented apprentice into creative force reshaping the family business, demonstrating design innovations that attracted attention from clients who wanted something beyond the historical revival styles that dominated Parisian jewelry. At 24 years old, he possessed the dangerous combination of artistic vision and commercial ambition that marks individuals destined to transform their industries, along with the obsessive work ethic that would define and ultimately destroy him in the decades ahead, that would build an empire while consuming the man who created it. The transformation began officially in 1899, when Alfred Cartier, recognizing both his son's abilities and his own limitations, began transferring operational control of the Rue de la Paix establishment to Louis while retaining nominal ownership. A gradual transition that would be formalized in 1902 when Louis officially took over management of the firm. This transfer of power coincided with the dawn of a new century, with Paris preparing for the Exposition Universelle of 1900 that would showcase French decorative arts to the world, with the Belle Epoque entering its most glittering phase when wealth and culture and technological progress seemed to promise unlimited possibility before war would shatter such optimism. Louis seized control with ideas that had been accumulating during his apprenticeship years, beginning to implement design philosophy that would distinguish Cartier from competitors who remained committed to historical styles. He studied the Art Nouveau movement that was revolutionizing architecture and decorative arts, appreciated its embrace of natural forms and flowing lines, but rejected what he saw as excessive ornamentation that would date quickly, preferring instead a cleaner aesthetic that emphasized the inherent beauty of gemstones rather than overwhelming them with elaborate settings. This design philosophy, later associated with the emerging Art Deco movement, would become his signature, would make Cartier jewels instantly recognizable for their geometric precision, their restraint, their emphasis on stone quality over setting complexity. But design innovation alone wouldn't build an empire in the competitive world of Parisian luxury commerce, where dozens of established houses competed for the same wealthy clientele. Louis understood that success required not just creating beautiful objects, but building relationships with the individuals who could afford such objects. That the jewelry business was as much about understanding social dynamics and personal psychology as about understanding gemstones and metalwork. He began cultivating contacts among European aristocracy, among visiting Russian nobility who spent lavishly during Paris seasons, among American millionaires who sought European sophistication to legitimize New World fortunes, among the demi-monde of celebrated courtesans and actresses whose jewelry choices influenced fashion as much as those of respectable society women. His breakthrough came through a combination of design talent and social cultivation that secured Cartier's first truly spectacular commission in 1902, when Louis created jewelry for the coronation of Edward Roman VII of England, beginning a relationship with British royalty that would culminate in Edward declaring Cartier Jeweler of Kings and the King of Jewelers, a phrase that would become the house's most famous marketing slogan, that would open doors throughout European aristocracy, that would transform Cartier from successful Parisian jeweler into international luxury brand. The timing was perfect, as Edward Roman VII represented a new style of monarchy that embraced visible luxury and technological modernity, that rejected Victorian mourning aesthetics for Edwardian opulence, that created demand for the kind of innovative yet elegant designs that Louis Cartier was perfecting. The years between 1902 and 1910 saw explosive growth as Louis expanded beyond custom commissions into creating signature designs that could be reproduced across multiple clients, that could build brand recognition while maintaining exclusivity. In 1904, He created the Santos wristwatch for his friend Alberto Santos Dumont, the Brazilian aviation pioneer who complained that pocket watches were impractical when flying. This innovation, creating a wristwatch for a man when such items were considered feminine accessories, demonstrated Louis's willingness to break conventions when he saw commercial and creative opportunity. The Santos watch would become one of Cartier's most enduring designs, still produced over a century later, a testament to Louis's ability to create objects that transcended fashion to achieve timeless appeal. In 1906, he opened Cartier's first international branch in London at 175-176 New Bond Street, expanding beyond Paris to capture British aristocracy and the international elite who gathered in London for social season, who wanted access to Cartier designs without traveling to Paris. This expansion required not just capital but family cooperation, as Louis convinced his younger brother Jacques to move to London and manage the new boutique, to represent the Cartier brand to British clients who expected the same level of service and expertise they would receive in Paris. Jacques proved adept at understanding British taste, at navigating the subtle social distinctions that mattered in Edwardian London, at securing commissions from royal family members and their circle who became Cartier's most prestigious clients. Meanwhile in Paris, Louis continued pushing creative boundaries, experimenting with platinum settings that allowed stones to be held with less metal showing, creating the illusion that diamonds floated against skin rather than being mounted in visible frameworks. This technical innovation required developing new tools and training craftsmen in unfamiliar techniques, required convincing clients that platinum's higher cost produced superior results, required patience as the market slowly recognized that these cleaner settings showcased stone quality in ways that traditional gold settings could not match. By 1910, platinum had become Cartier's signature metal, the material that enabled the geometric precision and clean lines that would define the Art Deco aesthetic emerging in the decade ahead. During this period of explosive creative and commercial growth, Louis also married, wedding André Caroline Worth in 1902, in a union that combined personal affection with commercial advantage. As the Worth family represented French haute couture through the House of Worth that dressed European aristocracy and American plutocracy, the marriage produced a daughter, Marion, but the relationship would prove complicated as Louis's obsessive dedication to building the Cartier empire left little time or energy for domestic life, a pattern that would repeat throughout his life, that would leave personal relationships undernourished while professional achievements accumulated. The year 1907 brought another expansion when Louis and his brother Pierre opened a Cartier boutique in St. Petersburg, capitalizing on Russian aristocracy's legendary appetite for luxury goods and their particular fondness for French culture and craftsmanship. The Russian market proved spectacularly profitable as Grand Dukes and wealthy merchants competed to commission the most elaborate pieces, as the imperial family itself became Cartier clients, purchasing everything from cigarette cases to tiaras. Louis personally traveled to St. Petersburg multiple times, studying Russian decorative arts traditions, incorporating Slavic motifs into designs created specifically for this market, demonstrating his ability to adapt Cartier's signature aesthetic to different cultural contexts without compromising brand identity. But the Russian expansion also demonstrated Louis's growing expertise in gemstone sourcing, as he established relationships with dealers who could supply the exceptional stones that major commissions required, who could find perfectly matched diamonds for necklaces, who could source rare colored gems from mines in Burma and Ceylon and Brazil. This expertise in stone acquisition became as important to Cartier's reputation as design innovation, as clients learned that Cartier wouldn't compromise on material quality, that a Cartier piece guaranteed not just beautiful design, but exceptional stones set with technical mastery. By 1909, Louis had formalized the family business structure by creating a partnership among the three Cartier brothers, Louis focusing on design and Parisian operations, Pierre managing American expansion after opening a New York boutique on Fifth Avenue in 1909, Jacques overseeing London operations and sourcing expeditions to India and the Middle East, where he cultivated relationships with maharajas and pearl dealers. This division of responsibilities allowed the Cartier brand to expand globally while maintaining family control, to pursue opportunities across 3 continents, while ensuring that quality standards remained consistent across all locations. The New York opening in 1909 brought Cartier to America at precisely the moment when American millionaires were seeking European validation, when families who had made fortunes in railroads and steel and banking wanted luxury goods that announced their arrival among global elite, when American heiresses were marrying European aristocrats and demanding jewels that met old world standards. Pierre Cartier recognized this market's potential, understood that American wealth was surpassing European wealth even as American taste still deferred to European sophistication, positioned Cartier as the bridge between New World money and Old World refinement. Throughout this period of expansion, Louis maintained his design focus, creating the famous Cartier mystery clocks between 1912 and 1914, timepieces where clock hands appeared to float in midair without visible connection to mechanism, achieved through transparent crystal discs that hid the mechanical connection while creating magical illusion. These clocks represented Louis's design philosophy perfected, technical mastery deployed to create objects that seemed to transcend mechanical reality, that appeared as art rather than engineering, that commanded extraordinary prices from clients who wanted objects that demonstrated not just wealth but sophisticated taste. The mystery clocks also demonstrated another aspect of Louis's genius, his understanding that luxury goods succeeded not just through beauty, but through storytelling, that objects acquired additional value when they came with narratives about their creation, about the technical challenges overcome, about the vision required to imagine something that hadn't existed before. He cultivated relationships with journalists and critics who would write about Cartier innovations, who would explain to readers why a Cartier piece deserved its premium price, who would build the mythology that transformed luxury goods into cultural artifacts worthy of museum display. By 1914, on the eve of the Great War that would shatter Belle Epoque civilization, Louis Cartier had achieved extraordinary success measured by any metric, financially, creatively, socially. The firm employed hundreds of craftsmen across 3 continents, maintained boutiques in the world's great luxury capitals, counted among its clients virtually every royal family in Europe plus Russian Grand Dukes and Indian maharajas, and American millionaires and South American mining magnates. Louis himself was recognized as preeminent jewelry designer of his generation, had secured patents on innovations that competitors rushed to copy, had created signature pieces like the Santos watch and mystery clocks that would endure for generations. But success had come at cost that was becoming apparent to those who knew Louis well, who noticed his declining health, his inability to rest even when exhausted, his tendency to work through weekends and holidays while competitors relaxed, his habit of returning to workshops late at night to review craftsmen's work, to adjust designs, to obsess over details that most clients would never notice, but that Louis couldn't ignore because perfection was not negotiable. Because the Cartier name couldn't be attached to anything less than the absolute best work possible regardless of the personal cost such standards demanded. War was coming, and with it, changes that would test whether the empire Louis had built could survive global catastrophe, whether the clientele that supported luxury commerce would endure the destruction ahead, whether Louis himself would survive the pressures that were already consuming him from within even as his professional triumphs accumulated. Palace acquired in 1911, at the height of Belle Epoque prosperity, and 2 years after opening the New York boutique that would cement Cartier's position as truly global luxury brand, Louis Cartier made a decision that would symbolize both his triumph and the burden that came with such triumph. He purchased the building at 13 Rue de la Paix that had housed Cartier's Parisian operations since his father's bold move in 1895, transforming from tenant to owner, from occupant to proprietor of the address that had become synonymous with the Cartier name. The purchase price of 850,000 francs represented substantial capital, even for a business generating the revenues that Cartier commanded. But Louis understood that ownership meant permanence, meant control over the building's future, meant the ability to renovate and expand without landlord constraints. The building itself stood as testament to Second Empire elegance, erected during the 1860, when Baron Haussmann's redesign of Paris created the wide boulevards and uniform facades that gave the city its characteristic appearance, when limestone and mansard roofs and iron balconies became the vocabulary of Parisian architecture. Number 13, Rue de la Paix occupied prestigious location steps from Place Vendôme, where Napoleon's column rose 44 meters above the square that had become the epicenter of French luxury commerce, where jewelers and couturiers and perfumers clustered to capture the attention of wealthy clients who stayed at nearby hotels or maintained apartments in the fashionable First Arrondissement. The property consisted of 5 floors rising above ground-level retail space, with the second floor traditionally reserved for reception salons, where clients would view jewels in elegant surroundings that suggested refined taste rather than commercial transaction, where Louis maintained his personal office overlooking Rue de la Paix's constant flow of carriages and later automobiles, bringing the wealthy to appointments at Cartier and neighboring establishments. The upper floors housed workshops where craftsmen executed designs under Louis's exacting supervision, where stones were cut and set, where metal was worked and polished, where the transformation from raw materials to finished luxury objects occurred behind closed doors that protected technical secrets from competitors, while maintaining the illusion that jewels emerged from artistic inspiration rather than skilled labor. Upon taking ownership, Louis immediately commissioned extensive renovations to transform the building's interior into spaces that reflected Cartier's evolving aesthetic, that moved beyond Belle Epoque ornamentation toward the cleaner lines and geometric precision that would characterize Art Deco design. He hired architects and decorators who understood his vision for spaces that would serve as appropriate settings for the jewels clients came to purchase, that would suggest sophistication and modernity rather than historical nostalgia, that would differentiate Cartier from competitors still committed to Rococo revival or Neo-Renaissance styles that Louis considered dated. The renovation of the second-floor salons proceeded through 1912 and 1913, with Louis personally approving every design detail from the wall paneling's wood selection to the display cases' glass quality to the lighting fixture's ability to showcase gems without harsh glare that would distort color perception. He specified that cases should be designed to allow jewels to be displayed against neutral backgrounds that wouldn't compete for attention, that lighting should approximate natural daylight to ensure clients saw accurate stone colors, that seating should be comfortable enough for extended consultations, but not so luxurious as to encourage time wasting by clients who weren't serious purchasers. The renovated salons featured walls covered in pale gray silk that provided perfect backdrop for viewing jewels, furniture in the emerging Art Deco style that emphasized geometric forms and exotic materials like Makassar ebony and shagreen, and carefully curated objets d'art, including Chinese porcelains and Japanese lacquerwork, that demonstrated Louis's sophisticated taste while suggesting the global sources from which Cartier drew inspiration. The overall effect was calculated to make clients feel they had entered a space that transcended mere retail commerce, that they were participating in an aesthetic experience, where purchasing a jewel meant joining a cultural conversation about beauty and modernity, and the relationship between art and luxury. But the building's most significant feature wasn't the client-facing salons, but rather the expanded workshops on the upper floors, where Louis invested heavily in creating ideal conditions for craftsmen to execute his increasingly complex designs. He understood that Cartier's reputation ultimately depended on execution quality, that innovative designs meant nothing if craftsmen lacked the tools or training or working conditions to realize those designs properly. The workshops featured north-facing windows that provided consistent natural light throughout the day, ventilation systems that removed fumes from soldering and polishing, individual workbenches equipped with specialized tools, and a hierarchical organization where master craftsmen supervised journeymen who in turn supervised apprentices in a system that preserved traditional skills while incorporating new techniques Louis's designs demanded. Louis maintained office adjacent to the workshops, positioned so he could observe craftsmen at work without them feeling constantly supervised, close enough that he could examine work in progress when questions arose, separated enough that his presence didn't inhibit the concentration detailed jewelry work required. This office became his sanctuary and prison, the place where he spent increasingly long hours reviewing designs and examining finished pieces, and sketching new ideas and studying gemstones under magnification. The place where the obsessive perfectionism that made Cartier legendary also consumed Louis's health and peace and any possibility of life beyond work. The workshops also housed Cartier's growing collection of gemstones awaiting appropriate commissions, an inventory worth hundreds of thousands of francs carefully organized by stone type and quality, secured in vaults that Louis personally inspected regularly, insured against theft and fire, but also against the market fluctuations that could render today's carefully chosen stock less desirable tomorrow when fashion shifted. Louis understood that access to exceptional stones provided competitive advantage, that when a client requested a specific commission, the ability to immediately present perfectly matched diamonds or rare colored gems could close sales that competitors would lose during the weeks or months required to source appropriate materials. Beyond the workshops and salons, the building included Louis's private apartment on the 4th floor, a space that should have provided refuge from professional demands, but instead became merely another location where work continued, where Louis would retreat not to rest, but to sketch designs late into the night, to review account books, to plan expansions and innovations, to worry about competitors and costs, and the thousand details that building a global luxury empire demanded. The apartment's decoration reflected his taste for emerging Art Deco aesthetic, furniture by designers like Émile Jacques Ruhlmann, lighting fixtures in the geometric style that was replacing Art Nouveau's organic forms, art including paintings and sculptures that demonstrated Louis's engagement with contemporary artistic movements. The decision to purchase rather than continue leasing the Rue de la Paix building reflected Louis's confidence in Cartier's future, his belief that the firm would continue growing, that the address would remain prestigious, that ownership represented not just real estate investment but symbolic commitment to Paris as Cartier's spiritual home, regardless of how far the brand expanded internationally. The purchase also reflected his increasing wealth, his ability to deploy substantial capital for strategic purposes, his transformation from craftsmen who worked for living to businessmen who commanded resources sufficient to make major acquisitions. But the building purchase also represented burden, added to the weight of responsibilities Louis already carried as Cartier's creative director and operational manager and public face to aristocratic clients who expected personal attention from the master himself. Every franc invested in the building was a franc that couldn't be invested elsewhere. Every design decision about renovation was another decision requiring his attention. Every aspect of managing the property added to the administrative duties that consumed time Louis would have preferred to spend designing. The Rue de la Paix mansion, for that is what the building became under Louis's ownership, more palace than shop, more atelier than retail establishment, stood as physical manifestation of everything Cartier represented. Elegance without ostentation, modernity grounded in craftsmanship traditions, luxury defined by quality rather than mere expense, French cultural sophistication deployed for global commercial success. The building's classical Haussmannian facade announced continuity with Parisian traditions, while the Art Deco interiors declared commitment to contemporary aesthetics, a balance that perfectly captured Louis's design philosophy of respecting tradition while rejecting nostalgia. By 1914, when war would disrupt everything, when the glittering world of Belle Epoque luxury would shatter under artillery bombardments that spared nothing, the Rue de la Paix building represented Louis Cartier's supreme achievement and his growing trap, the palace that showcased his genius and imprisoned his life, the mansion that bore his name and demanded he sacrifice everything else to maintain the standards that made that name legendary. The palace was acquired, the empire was established, the Cartier name was secure. But the man who had built it all was beginning to fracture under pressures that wealth and fame and professional triumph could not relieve, that would only intensify in the decades ahead, that would ultimately consume him in the same mansion where his greatest works were created. Gilded years for the years between 1911 and 1914, before the Great War would shatter Belle Epoque civilization and transform European society beyond recognition. Louis Cartier presided over his Rue de la Paix mansion during the period that would later be remembered as the golden twilight of the old order, when European aristocracy still commanded wealth and social authority, when luxury commerce flourished among international elite who traveled seamlessly between Paris and London, and St. Petersburg and New York, when Cartier jewels adorned women at court presentations and opera performances and country house weekends that seemed eternal even as they approached their violent conclusion. The daily rhythm at 13 Rue de la Paix reflected the dual nature of luxury jewelry business. Public performances in elegant salons, where clients experienced Cartier as purveyor of refined taste, and private intensity in workshops where craftsmen executed Louis's exacting designs under conditions that tolerated no compromise. Louis himself moved between these worlds, greeting important clients personally in the salons, where his presence validated their significance and justified premium prices, then retreating to workshops where he would examine pieces with jeweler's loupe to verify that execution matched his specifications, that no detail fell short of perfection regardless of whether clients would notice such details. The salons hosted extraordinary procession of European aristocracy and international wealth during these years, as Cartier's reputation attracted everyone who mattered in the intersecting worlds of old money and new, inherited titles and earned fortunes. Russian Grand Dukes would arrive with retinues of servants carrying jewels to be reset or appraised, spending lavishly on pieces that announced their status within imperial hierarchy. American heiresses preparing for marriages to European aristocrats would consult Louis about tiara designs appropriate for their new stations, needing jewels that satisfied old-world expectations without appearing pretentious. Indian Maharajas visiting Paris would commission pieces incorporating extraordinary colored gems from their territories, wanting Cartier's design expertise applied to stones they provided, creating hybrid pieces that combined French sophistication with Indian opulence. Louis developed different approaches for different client categories, understanding that Russian nobility responded to bold, heavily jeweled designs that emphasized carat weight and visual impact, while French aristocracy preferred more restrained pieces that suggested taste rather than wealth, while American clients wanted showpiece jewels that would photograph impressively and provoke envy among social competitors. This ability to calibrate designs to different cultural expectations while maintaining coherent Cartier aesthetic allowed the brand to expand globally without becoming generic, to serve diverse markets without diluting identity. The years 1912 and 1913 saw Louis perfect the design innovations that would define Cartier's mature style. The garland motifs adapted from Louis Roman XVI jewelry that appealed to clients' nostalgia, while being executed with contemporary platinum techniques. The increasingly geometric forms that anticipated Art Deco aesthetics, the incorporation of exotic materials like jade and coral and enamel, alongside traditional diamonds and colored gems, the emphasis on overall design harmony rather than merely assembling expensive stones. He created during this period some of Cartier's most celebrated pieces, commissioned by clients whose names represented the apex of European society, pieces that would later be photographed for publications celebrating the golden age of jewelry before war changed everything. But success brought pressures that Louis handled through increasingly obsessive work habits that concerned his family and closest associates. He typically arrived at the Rue de la Paix mansion before 9 in the morning, and frequently remained past midnight, reviewing the day's work, sketching new designs, examining stones, planning future collections. His wife Andre complained that she rarely saw him except at obligatory social functions, that their daughter Marion knew her father primarily as the man who appeared briefly at breakfast before departing for the mysterious world of the mansion, that Louis seemed incapable of separating himself from work even during weekends in the country or vacations at coastal resorts, where he would spend hours sketching rather than relaxing. His health began showing strain from this relentless pace: chronic headaches, digestive problems, insomnia despite exhaustion, weight loss that left him appearing gaunt in photographs from this period. Doctors advised rest and reduced workload, but Louis couldn't or wouldn't moderate his schedule, driven by perfectionism that made delegation difficult, by anxiety that competitors might overtake Cartier if he relaxed vigilance, by the addictive quality of creative work that provided satisfaction no other aspect of his life could match. Work became both his purpose and his escape, the thing that gave life meaning and the thing that prevented him from finding meaning elsewhere. The mansion itself reflected this duality, serving as stage for public triumph while witnessing private suffering. The elegant salons hosted celebrations of aristocratic life, engagement rings purchased by nervous suitors, tiaras commissioned for debutante balls, anniversary jewels marking decades of marriage, inheritance pieces reset for new generations. But the private office where Louis spent most hours told different story, with its accumulation of unfinished sketches suggesting perfectionism that could never be satisfied, with ashtrays overflowing from cigarettes smoked while reviewing designs, with account books revealing the financial pressures that accompanied expansion, with correspondence showing the endless demands from brothers in London and New York requesting designs and stones and approvals. Yet despite personal cost, these years produced work that justified Louis's sacrifices in ways that seemed meaningful to him, if not to family members who wanted more of his attention. The mystery clocks he perfected during 1912–1913 represented technical achievements that competitors couldn't duplicate, that commanded prices approaching 100,000 francs from clients who wanted objects that seemed to transcend mechanical reality. The platinum jewelry settings he pioneered became industry standard, copied by every major jeweler but never quite duplicated, because Louis maintained quality standards others couldn't match. The garland style he developed influenced fashion across decorative arts, appearing in architecture and furniture and textile design as the Art Deco aesthetic emerged. Social occasions at the mansion during these years took form of intimate dinners rather than lavish balls, with Louis preferring small gatherings where conversation focused on art and design rather than society gossip, where guests included artists and architects and writers rather than merely wealthy clients. He cultivated friendships with figures like Santos Dumont the aviator, like Cocteau the writer, like designers working in other luxury trades who shared his commitment to excellence, who understood the obsessive dedication required to achieve mastery, who accepted his tendency to excuse himself mid-evening to review urgent work in his office before returning to table. His relationship with his brothers provided both support and tension during these years. Pierre in New York proved commercially brilliant, developing American market beyond Louis's initial expectations. But his success created pressure to provide designs that would appeal to American taste without compromising Cartier's French identity. Jacques in London managed British operations smoothly, while organizing sourcing expeditions to India that secured extraordinary gems. But his independence sometimes clashed with Louis's desire to control every aspect of brand presentation. The three brothers maintained affection and mutual respect, but also competed for dominance within family business structure, a dynamic that added stress to Louis's already overwhelming responsibilities. The mansion's workshops during peak periods employed over 60 craftsmen working in specialized roles: diamond setters, stone cutters, metal workers, enamelers, polishers, each trained in particular techniques, each contributing to pieces that bore Louis's designs and Cartier's name. Louis knew these men by name, understood their individual strengths and weaknesses, could predict which craftsmen should execute which design based on technical demands and aesthetic requirements. He maintained paternalistic relationship with workshop staff, paying above market wages to retain best craftsmen, providing support during family emergencies, maintaining loyalty that kept Cartier's technical secrets protected from competitors who tried to poach skilled workers. But this paternalism also meant Louis felt personally responsible when economic pressures required reducing workshop hours or delaying purchases of new equipment, when slower periods meant some craftsmen worked part-time, when the business cycle's inevitable fluctuations affected men who depended on steady employment. These concerns added to the burden he carried, to the sense that maintaining the mansion meant maintaining dozens of livelihoods beyond his own family's welfare. As 1914 approached, as tensions between European powers escalated toward conflict that optimists believed impossible in modern civilization, Louis Cartier stood at peak of professional achievement and personal exhaustion. The mansion on Rue de la Paix represented everything he had worked to create: headquarters of global luxury brand, workshop producing the era's finest jewelry, salon attracting the world's elite, symbol of French cultural supremacy in decorative arts. But it also represented trap he had built around himself, palace that demanded his constant attention, empire that couldn't function without his participation, success that prevented the rest and peace and balanced life that doctors increasingly insisted he needed. The golden years were approaching their end. War was coming, and with it, changes that would test whether Louis Cartier's masterwork could survive catastrophe, whether the man himself could endure the additional pressures that global conflict would impose on business and health and spirit, already strained near breaking. War shadows the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, triggered diplomatic crisis that accelerated through July toward mobilization and declarations of war that would transform European civilization and shatter the Belle Epoque world where Cartier had flourished. For Louis Cartier, observing events from his Rue de la Paix mansion, as Austria issued ultimatums to Serbia and Russia, mobilized in support of its Slavic ally in Germany, activated war plans that required invading Belgium and France. The unfolding catastrophe threatened not just personal safety, but the entire commercial structure he had spent 2 decades building. The international network of suppliers and clients and workshops that depended on peace and prosperity, and the free movement of goods and people across borders that were now being closed by mobilization orders. France's declaration of war on August 3, 1914, brought immediate disruption as the government ordered general mobilization that stripped workshops of craftsmen called to military service, as borders closed, cutting access to Russian clients and suppliers, as wealthy Parisians fled the city fearing German occupation, as the financial system froze, making international transactions difficult and credit scarce. The Rue de la Paix mansion that had bustled with activity weeks earlier fell suddenly quiet as clients canceled appointments and craftsmen departed for training camps, and the machinery of luxury commerce ground to halt in the face of total wars, demands on national resources and attention. Louis found himself facing unprecedented challenges, as the war that everyone expected to end by Christmas instead deepened into prolonged conflict that consumed Europe's young men and productive capacity. The workshop staff declined from 60 craftsmen to barely 20, as military service claimed not just young apprentices, but experienced masters whose skills couldn't easily be replaced. Client base contracted as Russian nobility became enemies overnight, as British aristocrats focused on war contribution rather than jewelry purchases, as American clients postponed European trips until submarine warfare made Atlantic crossings too dangerous. Supply chains broke down as gemstone sources in colonies and distant territories became inaccessible, as precious metals were requisitioned for war production, as the elaborate logistics supporting international luxury commerce collapsed under military priorities. Yet despite these pressures, Louis kept the Rue de la Paix mansion operating through the war years, maintaining skeleton staff to execute commissions that still occasionally materialized, preserving institutional knowledge and client relationships against the day when peace would restore normal commerce, refusing to let Cartier disappear even as competitors closed their doors or converted to war production. This decision to maintain operations required drawing on financial reserves accumulated during prosperous pre-war years, required accepting losses that would have been unthinkable during peacetime, required faith that the world order would eventually be restored and luxury commerce would resume. The war years brought different rhythms to the mansion. Fewer client visits but longer consultations with those who came, often widows resetting inherited jewels or selling pieces to support wartime expenses, occasionally profiteers who had made fortunes from war contracts and wanted to display their new wealth, despite social disapproval of such ostentation during national crisis. The salons that had hosted Russian Grand Dukes and Indian Maharajas now received mainly French clients, many of them women whose husbands or sons were fighting at the front, who sought distraction from anxiety through the familiar ritual of examining jewels and discussing designs, even if actual purchases were deferred until after the war. Louis himself contributed to war efforts while maintaining business operations. He provided financial support to relief organizations, hosted fundraising events at the mansion, allowed workshop space to be used for assembling medical supplies, personally visited wounded soldiers in hospitals carrying small gifts. But he couldn't join military service despite pressure on men of fighting age to enlist, as he was too old at 39 when war began and suffered health problems that would have disqualified him regardless. This inability to serve directly created guilt that added to the psychological burden he carried, the sense that he was profiting from others' sacrifice by maintaining commercial enterprise while France's young men died in trenches. The war also disrupted family business structure that had depended on coordination between Paris, London, and New York branches. Communication with Jacques in London became difficult as channel crossings required military approval and mail service became unreliable. Contact with Pierre in New York faced even greater challenges as submarine warfare made Atlantic communications sporadic and dangerous. The three brothers who had built global empire through constant coordination now operated largely independently, making decisions without consultation that would have been unthinkable during peacetime, trusting that family bonds and shared commitment to Cartier name would preserve coherence despite distance. Financial pressures intensified as the war dragged through 1915 and 1916 without resolution, as expenses continued while revenues collapsed, as Louis watched accumulated capital erode month by month with no clear end in sight. He reduced his own salary to help maintain workshop staff, mortgaged the Rue de la Paix building to raise operating capital, sold parts of the gemstone inventory at depressed prices to generate cash flow. These measures bought time but couldn't be sustained indefinitely. And by 1917, Louis faced the possibility that Cartier might not survive the war, that the empire he had built might collapse despite all efforts to preserve it. The stress manifested in deteriorating physical and mental health, chronic insomnia, digestive problems that left him unable to eat properly, anxiety that made concentration difficult, depression that sapped the creative energy that had always been his greatest asset. Doctors prescribed rest cures and dietary restrictions and nervous tonics that provided temporary relief, but couldn't address underlying problem that Louis was constitutionally incapable of separating himself from work, that Cartier's survival felt like personal survival, that reducing his commitment to the business felt like surrendering to forces beyond his control. His marriage to André, already strained by his obsessive work habits during prosperous years, came under additional pressure during war years, when financial anxiety and health problems made him even less available emotionally, even more withdrawn into the world of the mansion, where at least he understood the challenges and had some agency to respond. André, facing her own wartime burdens of managing household with reduced staff, and dealing with shortages and worrying about relatives at the front, needed support that Louis couldn't provide, creating distance that would eventually become unbridgeable. Yet the war years also demonstrated Louis's resilience and business acumen under pressure. When Russian clients became inaccessible, he cultivated relationships with neutral Spanish and South American buyers who had money and wanted French luxury goods. When traditional advertising became impossible due to paper shortages and censorship, he maintained Cartier's visibility through strategic publicity around pieces created for patriotic fundraising. When craftsmen were scarce, he simplified designs to require less labor while maintaining quality standards. When materials were restricted, he innovated with whatever materials remained available, creating pieces that reflected wartime constraints without appearing cheap. By late 1917, when American entry into the war brought new resources to Allied cause and German exhaustion became apparent, Louis allowed himself cautious optimism that Cartier would survive, that the mansion would outlast the crisis, that post-war recovery would vindicate his decision to maintain operations through years when closure would have been easier and perhaps financially wiser. But survival came at cost measured not just in depleted capital and reduced inventory, but in Louis's deteriorated health and strained relationships, and the growing sense that he had sacrificed too much of himself to the business, that the mansion had claimed him so completely that little remained of the man who had once had other interests and relationships and dreams beyond jewelry. The armistice of November 11, 1918, brought relief and exhaustion in equal measure. The war was over, but 4 years of conflict had killed millions and devastated European economy and destroyed the social order that had supported luxury commerce before 1914. The Cartier mansion had survived, but the world it served had been transformed, and rebuilding would require energies that Louis wasn't sure he still possessed. Breaking point: the post-war years between 1919 and 1925 brought challenges different from but no less demanding than those Louis Cartier had navigated during the conflict itself. As he struggled to rebuild business operations while adapting to transformed social and economic landscape, where pre-war aristocratic clientele had lost wealth and influence, where new money from war profiteers and American industrialists demanded different approaches, where the cultural mood rejected Belle Epoque elegance for Jazz-age modernity, where exhaustion from 4 years of total war left him physically and emotionally depleted at precisely the moment when business required maximum creative and commercial energy. The immediate post-war period saw a brief surge of demand as wealthy clients who had deferred purchases during conflict years rushed to resume normal life patterns. As soldiers returning from front spent accumulated wages on engagement rings for sweethearts who had waited. As society resumed balls and weddings and the ceremonial occasions that required jewelry. But this revival proved temporary and incomplete. Russian nobility who had been major clients before 1914 were dead or exiled or dispossessed by Bolshevik revolution. German and Austrian aristocrats were impoverished by defeat and inflation. Even French and British aristocracy faced reduced circumstances as agricultural rents declined, and death duties consumed estates, and the economic basis of old wealth eroded beneath social and political changes accelerated by war. Louis responded by shifting focus toward emerging clientele, American millionaires whose industrial and financial power had grown during war years, who wanted European sophistication but demanded American efficiency, who purchased jewels as investment and status symbol rather than family heirloom. This market required different design approach, emphasizing showier pieces that would photograph well and impress observers, accepting that many purchases would be resold after several years rather than pass through generations, adapting to faster fashion cycles that rejected the idea of timeless classics for the excitement of seasonal novelty. The mansion itself required updating to reflect post-war aesthetic shifts, as Art Deco style that Louis had helped pioneer before 1914 now became dominant decorative mode, replacing Belle Epoque ornamentation with geometric precision and exotic materials. Louis commissioned renovations to the salons, installing new display cases and lighting that showcased jewels against neutral backgrounds, incorporating furniture by leading Art Deco designers, updating the building's presentation to signal that Cartier remained at fashion's forefront rather than trapped in nostalgia for disappeared world. These renovations consumed capital at a moment when cash flow remained uncertain, when expenses exceeded revenues, when every investment represented gamble that recovery would continue rather than collapse into renewed crisis. But the greatest challenge facing Louis during these years wasn't commercial or aesthetic, but personal. His health, already compromised by wartime stress and decades of overwork, deteriorated significantly as chronic digestive problems intensified into serious medical condition that doctors struggled to diagnose properly. He suffered from persistent abdominal pain, nausea, weight loss, fatigue that made even routine tasks difficult. Multiple specialists examined him, proposed various diagnoses ranging from ulcers to nervous dyspepsia to early cancer, prescribed treatments that provided limited relief, dietary restrictions, nervous tonics, rest cures that Louis couldn't sustain because business demanded his attention. The pain became his constant companion, affecting concentration, disrupting sleep, making the long hours he had previously sustained impossible to maintain. He found himself unable to stand for extended periods during client consultations, unable to focus on detailed design work without breaks, unable to manage the exhausting social performances that luxury commerce required. His appearance changed noticeably, always slender. He now appeared emaciated, his face drawn and aged beyond his years, his movements careful and guarded, his energy clearly limited. His marriage to Andrée effectively ended during this period, though divorce wouldn't be formalized until later. The emotional distance that had opened during war years became unbridgeable as Louis's health problems made him even more difficult to live with, as Andrée's patience with his work obsession finally exhausted, as both recognized that whatever affection had existed at the marriage's beginning had been consumed by years of Louis prioritizing business over relationship. They maintained civil relations for their daughter Marianne's sake, but lived increasingly separate lives, Andrée pursuing social activities while Louis remained isolated in the mansion, withdrawn into the work that was both killing him and the only thing that gave his suffering meaning. During 1923, Louis began relationship with Jacqueline Almasy, a divorced Hungarian aristocrat decades his junior who brought temporary brightness to his increasingly dark life. Jacqueline represented everything Louis's first marriage hadn't provided: genuine interest in his work, emotional support during health crises, willingness to accept his devotion to Cartier rather than competing with it. She would eventually become his second wife in 1924 after his divorce from André was finalized, bringing some measure of personal happiness during the final decades of his life, though by then the damage to his health was irreversible. The business pressures continued relentlessly, despite Louis's declining capacity to manage them. Competition intensified as American jewelers like Tiffany and Van Cleef and Arpels expanded operations, as new players entered luxury market, as clients had more options and less loyalty than during pre-war years when Cartier's preeminence had been unquestioned. Pierre in New York pushed for more autonomy to respond to American market conditions, creating tensions with Louis, who wanted to maintain design consistency across all Cartier branches. Jacques in London dealt with British clients' reduced purchasing power, requiring adjustments to product mix toward less expensive items that would have been beneath Cartier's dignity before the war. Financial reports showed concerning trends: revenues recovering but not to pre-war levels, expenses growing faster than income, profit margins compressed, cash reserves depleted, debt accumulating. Louis found himself making decisions he never imagined would be necessary: reducing workshop staff, delaying equipment upgrades, accepting commissions he would have rejected as beneath Cartier standards, negotiating credit extensions with suppliers who questioned whether the Cartier name still guaranteed payment. The mansion that had symbolized triumph now felt like burden, its maintenance costs and mortgage payments consuming resources that might have been deployed more productively. Yet Louis couldn't imagine selling the Rue de la Paix building, couldn't accept that Cartier might operate from less prestigious address, couldn't surrender the symbol even as the reality became increasingly difficult to sustain. The mansion had become inseparable from his identity, from his understanding of who he was and what he had achieved, from the narrative he had constructed about his life's meaning. Letting go would have meant admitting defeat, acknowledging that the empire he had built was crumbling, confronting the possibility that his sacrifices had been for nothing. The breaking point came gradually rather than in single catastrophic moment, not a dramatic collapse but slow erosion of will and capacity, accumulation of physical pain and financial anxiety, and emotional exhaustion that finally overwhelmed even Louis's legendary determination. By 1925, he could no longer deny that he needed to reduce his active management role, that continuing at current pace would kill him, that some accommodation with his body's limitations had to be reached regardless of what the business demanded. He began delegating more responsibility to trusted associates, reducing his hours at the mansion, accepting that perfection wasn't achievable when he lacked strength to enforce his standards personally. This delegation felt like failure, but also brought some relief, allowed him to focus on the design work he still enjoyed rather than administrative details that exhausted him, created space for the relationship with Jacqueline that provided his only real comfort during these difficult years. But even as he stepped back from day-to-day operations, Louis couldn't truly separate himself from the business, couldn't stop worrying about whether standards would be maintained without his vigilance, couldn't rest while Cartier faced challenges that threatened everything he had built. The mansion remained his obsession and his trap, the achievement that justified his suffering and the suffering that negated the achievement, the palace he had created and the prison he couldn't escape. Silent decline. The years between 1925 and 1942 saw Louis Cartier transformed from active creative director into diminished figure, increasingly peripheral to the business that bore his name, as advancing illness and age reduced his capacity, while younger associates assumed responsibilities he had once guarded jealously. As the Art Deco aesthetic he had pioneered became established style, and new design innovations came from others. As the mansion on Rue de la Paix continued operating, but under management that reflected Louis's vision more than his direct participation. This period of decline proceeded not through dramatic deterioration, but through gradual reduction: fewer hours at the workshop, less energy for client consultations, diminished ability to focus on complex designs, withdrawal from the social performances that luxury commerce required. His marriage to Jacqueline in 1924 provided some stability during these declining years, as she managed household affairs and shielded Louis from demands he could no longer meet, as she maintained social connections that kept Cartier's name circulating among potential clients even as Louis himself attended fewer functions. But marriage couldn't cure the physical problems that plagued him. The chronic abdominal pain that doctors continued treating without successfully diagnosing its true nature. The digestive issues that made eating difficult and contributed to his gaunt appearance. The fatigue that limited his productive hours to brief periods in late morning and early afternoon, when pain medication provided temporary relief. The global economic crisis that began with the 1929 stock market crash and deepened through the early 1930s brought additional pressures that Louis was poorly equipped to handle in his compromised state. Luxury sales collapsed as wealthy clients watched fortunes evaporate, as unemployment soared and political instability threatened, as the economic system that had supported Cartier's business model seemed to be failing comprehensively. The mansion's workshops reduced staff to skeleton crews. Salons that had bustled with clients stood empty for days at a time. Inventories accumulated as purchases stopped. Debts mounted as creditors tightened terms and banking system contracted credit. Louis watched helplessly as the Depression tested Cartier's survival more severely than even the Great War had, as revenues declined month after month, as the business he had spent decades building teetered on the edge of collapse. His brothers Pierre and Jacques managed their respective markets with varying success. Pierre in New York navigating American economic catastrophe through strategic celebrity endorsements and creative financing. Jacques in London maintaining British operations through aristocratic connections and diversification into more affordable items. But Louis in Paris, weakened by illness and overwhelmed by crisis, contributed mainly through the value of his name and reputation rather than active management. During these Depression years, Louis's daily life contracted to narrow routine that reflected his limited energy and deteriorating health. He would arrive at the Rue de la Paix mansion mid-morning, after Jacqueline had supervised his breakfast and medication, spend several hours reviewing designs submitted by associates or examining gemstones that required expert evaluation, perhaps meet with one or two important clients who specifically requested consultation with Louis himself rather than junior staff, then return home by mid-afternoon before pain and exhaustion made continued work impossible. This reduced schedule represented profound change from the 16-hour days that had been normal throughout his career, from the obsessive engagement that had consumed him for decades, from the perfectionist supervision that had made Cartier legendary. The mansion itself showed signs of deferred maintenance as economic pressures made every expense questionable. Paint that needed refreshing went untouched. Worn carpets remained unreplaced. Equipment upgrades were postponed indefinitely. The building didn't fall into actual disrepair, but lost the immaculate presentation that Louis had always insisted upon, the attention to every detail that had signaled Cartier's uncompromising standards. To visitors who had known the mansion during its glory years, the subtle decline was noticeable and disturbing, suggesting that Cartier itself was fading along with its founder. Relationships with family members became strained during this period, as Louis's illness made him difficult and demanding, as financial pressures created conflicts over resource allocation between Paris and the London and New York branches, as succession questions emerged about who would ultimately control Cartier after Louis's inevitable death. His daughter Marion, now adult with her own family, visited the mansion occasionally, but found her father increasingly distant and withdrawn, more interested in discussing gemstones than asking about grandchildren, unable or unwilling to separate himself from business long enough to engage with family life. His brothers continued managing their operations largely independently, while maintaining nominal deference to Louis as the senior Cartier brother and design authority. But actual power had shifted toward Pierre, whose American market remained most profitable even during Depression, whose commercial instincts proved better suited to crisis management than Louis's perfectionism. This power shift wounded Louis's pride, even though he intellectually understood that business survival required adapting to changed circumstances, that his health prevented him from providing the leadership that crisis demanded, that holding onto control would be selfish and potentially destructive. The 1930s brought additional challenge as fascist movements gained strength across Europe, as political tensions escalated toward another global conflict, as the fragile post-war order that had allowed Cartier's recovery after 1918 began collapsing toward renewed catastrophe. Louis watched with horror as the civilized world he believed in, the European cultural order that had supported luxury commerce and valued beauty and craftsmanship, seemed to be destroying itself through totalitarian ideologies and militaristic nationalism and racist pseudoscience that rejected everything he held dear. The fall of France in June 1940 and subsequent German occupation of Paris brought Louis's world crashing down in ways that even the Depression hadn't achieved. The Rue de la Paix mansion continued operating under German occupation, but now its client base consisted partly of Nazi officers and their wives seeking luxuries that demonstrated power, that announced their conquest of the city that had symbolized European cultural sophistication. Louis, watching from his apartment as German staff cars parked outside the mansion he had built, as Wehrmacht officers entered salons where Russian Grand Dukes and British aristocrats had once shopped, felt the defeat not just as military and political catastrophe, but as personal violation, as desecration of everything he had worked to create. The occupation years 1940-1942 saw Louis become increasingly reclusive, spending more time in his apartment than at the mansion, avoiding contact with German clients who sought Cartier services, withdrawing from business operations that had become painful reminder of occupation's humiliations. His health continued deteriorating as cancer, finally properly diagnosed in 1941, spread through his digestive system, as doctors explained that treatment options were limited and prognosis was poor, as he faced the reality that the illness that had plagued him for years would ultimately kill him. Jacqueline cared for him with devotion that Louis had done little to earn, managing his pain medication, preparing the simple foods he could still digest, shielding him from demands and disturbances, providing the companionship that his first marriage had never offered. She watched him fade physically, while mentally he remained alert and engaged, still critiquing designs when associates sought his opinion, still evaluating gemstones when brought to his attention, still the perfectionist jeweler even as the man hosting that intelligence decayed. By early summer 1942, Louis understood that death was approaching, that the disease consuming him would soon complete its work, that the life he had built was nearing its end. He made peace with this reality in characteristic fashion, methodically, with attention to practical details, ensuring that business arrangements were documented and family provided for and personal affairs settled. He showed little fear of death itself but considerable anxiety about legacy, about whether the Cartier name would endure, about whether his work had meaning beyond the commercial success it had achieved. The mansion on Rue de la Paix continued operating during his final decline, workshops still producing jewels, salons still receiving clients, the machinery of commerce functioning despite occupation and Louis's absence, and the uncertainty surrounding Cartier's future leadership. The building he had purchased in 1911 and renovated to showcase his vision had outlasted his active participation, had become institution independent of its founder, symbol that transcended the man who created it. In late July 1942, confined to bed in his apartment, no longer able to visit the mansion even when pain medication provided temporary relief, Louis Cartier prepared for the end that doctors said was imminent, that his body welcomed even as his mind resisted. The empire would survive him. The name would endure. But the man who had sacrificed everything to build that empire, who had given health and marriage and peace to the perfection he demanded, would soon rest. His suffering finally ended. His legacy secured at cost that perhaps only he fully understood. Final rest on July 23, 1942, at 6:47 a.m. in his private apartment on Rue de la Paix. Louis Joseph Cartier died at age 66 from gastric cancer that had consumed him over years of misdiagnosis and ineffective treatment. His final breath witnessed by his wife Jacqueline, and attending physician Dr. Marcel Leroux, who recorded the time and cause on the death certificate required by Vichy government authorities administering occupied Paris. The room where death came overlooked the street that had been Louis's professional world for nearly 5 decades, where his mansion stood as testament to everything he had achieved, where craftsmen would continue their work unaware that the man whose designs they executed had just departed. His death came peacefully according to Dr. Leroux's account, facilitated by morphine that had become necessary during final weeks as pain overwhelmed other medications, as cancer spread through organs that could no longer function properly, as his body simply exhausted its capacity to continue. Jacqueline reported that Louis remained lucid until the final day, speaking occasionally about designs he wanted to perfect, about gemstones whose potential he saw but couldn't realize, about the mansion and whether it would survive the war, about regrets he expressed only partially before morphine claimed consciousness, and death followed hours later. News of Louis's death spread slowly through occupied Paris, where official announcements were controlled by German authorities and French newspapers operated under censorship that limited what could be published, where wartime conditions made communication difficult even for important events. The Cartier family notified key associates and clients privately, began arrangements for funeral that would be modest by choice and necessity. Wartime Paris was no place for elaborate ceremonies. Occupied city, where French citizens navigated between collaboration and resistance, couldn't appropriately mourn luxury jeweler, whose clients had included both sides of current conflict. The funeral took place on July 25, 1942, at the Church of Saint-Honoré-d'Eylau in the 16th arrondissement, the parish where Louis had been member during final years, where Jacqueline had arranged simple ceremony befitting wartime circumstances, and Louis's expressed wishes for minimal display. The service was attended by approximately 50 people, family members including Louis's daughter Marion and his brothers Pierre, who had managed to travel from New York despite wartime travel restrictions, and Jacques from London, longtime Cartier associates and craftsmen who had worked under Louis for decades, a few clients who maintained relationships despite occupation, representatives from rival jewelry houses who came to pay respects to master designer regardless of competitive relationships. Notable by their absence were the aristocratic European clients who had sustained Cartier before 1914, and through the 1920, Russian nobility were dead or exiled. German and Austrian aristocrats were now the enemy or compromised by collaboration. British aristocracy couldn't travel to occupied France. American clients were separated by war. The congregation that gathered to mourn Louis Cartier represented diminished world, fragments of commercial relationships and professional associations, rather than the glittering society that had once filled Cartier's salons with jewels and money and social ambition. The eulogy was delivered by Father Antoine Marchand, who had known Louis slightly through Jacqueline's church involvement, who spoke conventionally about Louis's contributions to French decorative arts, his dedication to craftsmanship, his support of charitable causes, his creation of employment for craftsmen who had learned their trades in Cartier workshops. Father Marchand acknowledged the difficult circumstances of Louis's death during occupation, expressed hope that peace would return and allow proper appreciation of Louis's legacy, offered conventional religious comfort about eternal rest, and resurrection that Louis himself had never shown much interest in during life. The burial took place at Cimetière de Paix in the 16th arrondissement, in the Cartier family vault, where Louis's remains would join those of other family members, where a simple marker bearing his name and dates would be installed when materials became available after the war. The committal service was brief, attended by a smaller group than the church funeral, completed quickly as wartime curfews and occupation regulations made extended ceremonies impractical and potentially dangerous. Public reaction to Louis's death was muted by wartime circumstances and censorship. Newspapers published brief notices acknowledging his death and funeral, limited to factual information, without the extensive obituaries that would have appeared in peacetime, without the appreciation of his contributions to French decorative arts that would have been normal for a figure of his stature. The jewelry industry trade publications that would have devoted pages to analyzing his career and influence were either suspended or operating under restrictions that prevented such coverage, postponing proper professional assessment until after war's conclusion. His will, executed in 1940, when cancer diagnosis made planning prudent, divided his estate between Jacqueline and daughter Marion, with provisions for longtime servants and specific bequests of personal items to associates and friends. The document revealed that Louis's personal fortune at death was smaller than might have been expected, approximately 800,000 francs in liquid assets beyond his ownership share in Cartier Enterprises, suggesting that most wealth had been reinvested in business rather than accumulated personally, that the luxury jeweler had not himself died wealthy despite managing business worth millions. The Rue de la Paix mansion was not part of his personal estate, but belonged to Cartier corporate structure that he had controlled through ownership shares, now transferred according to succession plans developed with his brothers. This separation of personal wealth from business assets was typical for family enterprises, but still striking. Louis had spent decades building an empire worth far more than his personal holdings, had sacrificed health and relationships to business that would continue without him, had exemplified the entrepreneur whose creation transcends and outlives its creator. The will also included instructions regarding his personal papers and design archives. Extensive collections of sketches and correspondence and technical notes accumulated over 40 years were to be preserved by Cartier for historical purposes, were not to be destroyed or dispersed, were to remain available for future craftsmen who might learn from studying his methods and thought processes. This provision revealed Louis's concern for legacy, his desire that his work would influence future generations, his understanding that designs themselves were not his only contribution, but also the approaches and philosophies that had informed those designs. In the weeks following Louis's death, Pierre Cartier assumed formal leadership of the company, coordinating operations across Paris, London, and New York, ensuring that business continuity despite founder's death, managing relationships with suppliers and clients who wondered whether Cartier could maintain standards without Louis's perfectionism. The mansion on Rue de la Paix continued operating throughout this transition, as workshops executed existing commissions and salons received clients, and the machinery of luxury commerce proceeded despite occupation and leadership transition and uncertainty about how war would ultimately affect the business. The craftsmen who had worked under Louis's direction for decades mourned him privately, understanding that they had lost not just employer but mentor who had taught them techniques and standards they would maintain throughout their careers, who had demanded excellence that made them better at their craft, who had created working conditions and compensation that recognized their essential contributions to Cartier's success. Several longtime employees wrote letters to Jacqueline expressing their grief and respect, describing specific moments when Louis had taught them something valuable, acknowledging that the best tribute they could offer was continuing the work he had cared about more than his own comfort or health. The mansion itself seemed to acknowledge Louis as passing through subtle changes noticeable to those who knew it well. The workshops operating more quietly without his occasional visits to inspect work in progress. The salons lacking the nervous energy that had accompanied expectations of his arrival. The private office remaining closed and dark, where it had previously shown lights late into evening, when Louis worked alone on designs or accounts. The building continued functioning, but something essential had departed, leaving structure and process but not the animating spirit that had made it more than commercial establishment. Louis Cartier was dead, but the empire he built would endure decades longer, would expand to continents he never visited, would become more valuable after his death than during his lifetime. The man had sacrificed everything: health, happiness, relationships, peace, to build something permanent. And he had succeeded, though whether success justified the cost remained question that only he could have answered. And he had taken that answer to grave in Cimetière de Paix, where his bones would rest while his name circled the globe on jewels he would never see, in markets he never imagined, among clients he never met. Estate transformed with Louis Cartier's death in 1942. The Rue de la Paix mansion entered new chapter in its history, transitioning from being the personal domain of its founder to becoming corporate headquarters of the global luxury brand that bore the Cartier name, but no longer depended on any single individual's vision or participation. The building that had witnessed Louis's triumph and decline would outlive him by decades, would survive war and occupation and liberation, would adapt to changing luxury markets and ownership structures, would transform repeatedly while maintaining its essential identity as physical embodiment of Cartier legacy. The immediate post-death period under German occupation saw the mansion continuing operations under Pierre Cartier's remote direction and Jacques Cartier's oversight during brief visits from London, when such travel was possible through neutral territories. The workshops maintained production at reduced levels, creating pieces for occupation authorities and their wives who wanted to demonstrate conquest by purchasing from France's most prestigious jeweler, creating uncomfortable revenue that kept craftsmen employed but reminded them daily of national humiliation. The salons received German officers who demanded service, while French staff maintained professional dignity despite resentment, navigating the impossible balance between collaboration necessary for survival and resistance to occupation's indignities. Liberation in August 1944 brought celebrations to Rue de la Paix as German troops withdrew and Free French forces entered Paris to ecstatic welcomes from population that had endured 4 years of occupation. The Cartier mansion flew French tricolor for the first time in years, as staff and craftsmen who had survived occupation gathered to mark the moment when their city and business could begin returning to normal operations, when luxury commerce could resume without the taint of serving conquerors, when planning for post-war future could begin. But liberation also brought investigations into wartime conduct, as authorities examined who had collaborated versus who had resisted, who had profited from occupation versus who had simply survived it. The Cartier business faced scrutiny about its wartime sales to German clients, its continued operations when some competitors had closed rather than serve occupiers, its commercial decisions during years when commerce itself was morally complicated. The investigations concluded that Cartier had done nothing illegal or excessively collaborative, had simply maintained business operations under occupation as many French enterprises had done, had not profited unduly or assisted German war efforts beyond ordinary commercial transactions. The post-war years brought gradual recovery as European economies stabilized and luxury markets revived, as American wealth-seeking European sophistication returned to Paris, as the mansion on Rue de la Paix resumed its role as destination for clients wanting finest jewelry available. But recovery also brought changes in management and ownership structure, as the three Cartier brothers who had built the global empire aged and began planning succession, as questions arose about whether next generation had the talent and commitment to maintain standards, as family business model showed strains common to enterprises transitioning from founders to heirs. In 1964, the Cartier family made controversial decision to sell majority ownership to outside investors, ending family control that had existed since Louis-François Cartier had founded the business in 1847, transforming Cartier from family enterprise into corporate entity, with professional management and shareholders expecting returns on investment. The sale shocked luxury industry and disappointed some longtime clients who valued the family connection, who believed that family ownership guaranteed commitment to quality over profits, who worried that corporate structure would compromise the perfectionism that had made Cartier legendary. The Rue de la Paix mansion remained Cartier's Parisian headquarters through this ownership transition, its prestigious address and historical associations too valuable to abandon, despite corporate restructuring. But the building underwent significant renovations during 1960 and 1970, as new ownership modernized facilities, updated security systems to protect increasingly valuable inventory, reconfigured spaces to improve workflow efficiency, installed contemporary design elements that sometimes clashed with buildings' historical character, but reflected commitment to remaining current rather than becoming museum of past glory. The workshops that had employed 60 craftsmen during Louis's prime shrank during this period, as Cartier increasingly sourced components from specialized suppliers, rather than maintaining in-house manufacturing for all aspects of jewelry production. This shift reflected broader industry trends toward concentration and specialization, toward separating design and assembly from component manufacturing, toward leveraging global supply chains rather than vertical integration. But the changes also meant the mansion lost some of its character as working atelier, became more showroom and corporate office than actual production facility, transformed from place where jewelry was made into place where it was displayed and sold. The 1970s brought additional challenges as luxury markets contracted during economic recession and energy crisis, as inflation eroded purchasing power, as political instability in various regions disrupted supply chains and client networks. The mansion weathered these difficulties through careful financial management and willingness to adapt product offerings, introducing more accessible price points alongside high-end pieces, expanding into watches and accessories beyond traditional jewelry focus, pursuing licensing arrangements that extended Cartier name to products Louis would never have considered, but that generated revenue-supporting core business. The 1980s marked renaissance for luxury brands as global economy recovered and wealth inequality created expanding market of ultra-wealthy clients seeking status goods, as emerging economies in Asia produced new luxury consumers, as luxury brands became global phenomena, transcending their original geographic and cultural contexts. Cartier participated aggressively in this expansion, opening boutiques in new markets, pursuing celebrity endorsements, investing in marketing campaigns that maintained brand prestige while building awareness among younger generations, transforming from European jeweler serving aristocracy into global luxury brand accessible to anyone with sufficient wealth. Throughout these transformations, the Rue de la Paix mansion maintained its role as symbolic heart of Cartier, even as actual business operations became increasingly dispersed across global network of boutiques and workshops and corporate offices. The building represented continuity amid change, tangible connection to history, even as business itself evolved beyond anything Louis could have imagined, physical reminder that Cartier meant something more than merely commercial success, that the name carried weight from legacy and tradition, and the pursuit of excellence that had consumed its founder's life. The mansion today operates as Cartier's flagship Parisian boutique and corporate headquarters, with ground-floor salons displaying current collections for clients who make appointments to view pieces in elegant surroundings, with upper floors housing executive offices and design studios, where contemporary Cartier designers work under same roof, where Louis once obsessed over every detail. The building has been renovated multiple times to maintain its prestigious appearance while incorporating modern systems and security, creating spaces that balance historical character with contemporary functionality, honoring past while serving present. Some elements from Louis's era survive, certain architectural features that couldn't be removed without damaging structure, display cases that have been preserved for historical value, workshop spaces that maintain traditional configurations because they work efficiently for skilled craftsmen. But the mansion has also incorporated contemporary design elements that reflect Cartier's evolution, that signal commitment to remaining current luxury brand rather than historical artifact, that acknowledge that honoring Louis's legacy means continuing the innovation he championed rather than freezing the business in nostalgic recreation of past. The transformation of the Rue de la Paix mansion from Louis Cartier's personal domain into corporate headquarters of global luxury conglomerate parallels the transformation of luxury commerce itself from artisanal craft to corporate enterprise, from family businesses to multinational corporations, from serving aristocratic elite to targeting global wealthy class. The building has adapted to these changes while maintaining the prestige that makes its address valuable, creating continuity between past and present that serves both historical preservation and commercial purposes. Legacy endures today. The mansion at 13 Rue de la Paix stands as monument to Louis Cartier's vision and sacrifice, as headquarters of luxury brand valued at billions of dollars, as working boutique where clients from around the world purchase jewels created according to principles Louis established over a century ago, as testament to the truth that creative excellence and commercial success, when combined with relentless dedication and willingness to pay personal costs, can build legacies that transcend individual lives and endure for generations after their creators have become dust. The building's facade remains largely unchanged from Louis's era, presenting the same limestone elegance to Rue de la Paix's flow of tourists and shoppers and luxury consumers that it presented to aristocratic clients arriving in carriages during Belle Epoque's glittering twilight. The address retains its prestige despite transformations in surrounding neighborhood, despite the democratization of luxury that has made Cartier accessible to broader market, despite changes in retail patterns and consumer behavior that have disrupted many traditional luxury establishments. Number 13, Rue de la Paix, still announces exclusivity and sophistication and connection to traditions that newer luxury brands cannot match regardless of marketing budgets or celebrity endorsements. The irony that shadows Louis Cartier's legacy is both obvious and profound. He died relatively poor, despite building business worth millions. Died from illness his wealth couldn't cure despite having resources to access best medical care available. Died alone in ways that mattered despite being surrounded by family and associates. Died having sacrificed personal happiness and health and relationships to build empire that would thrive without him, that would become more successful after his death than during his lifetime, that would expand to markets and scales he never imagined while operating according to principles he established. Louis never lived to see Cartier become the global phenomenon it is today, never saw the brand expand into Asian markets that now represent majority of luxury sales, never witnessed the transformation of luxury commerce from serving aristocratic minority to targeting global affluent class, never experienced the vindication of his belief that excellence and innovation would create enduring value. He died in occupied Paris, wondering whether Cartier would survive the war, whether the mansion would endure, whether his work had meaning beyond the commercial success it achieved during his lifetime. The answers to those questions became apparent only after his death, only as decades passed and Cartier not merely survived but thrived, expanding beyond jewelry into watches and accessories and lifestyle products, becoming one of the most recognized luxury brands worldwide, generating revenues that dwarf anything Louis achieved during his decades of leadership. The story of Louis Cartier reminds us that building enduring legacy often requires sacrifices that seem unreasonable to those who value balanced lives over exceptional achievement. That perfection demands costs measured not in money or time, but in health and happiness, and the quiet satisfactions that make lives worth living beyond professional accomplishments. Louis chose excellence over comfort, chose work over rest, chose legacy over life, and achieved the immortality he sought at price that perhaps only he could have calculated, that perhaps even he didn't fully understand until late in life when disease and decline forced accounting that couldn't be deferred. The mansion serves as his monument more effectively than any statue or plaque could, embodying in limestone and glass, and the continuing work of craftsmen the principles Louis lived by. That excellence cannot be compromised, that beauty justifies sacrifice, that creating objects that transcend their moment requires dedication that consumes their creators, that some legacies are worth any price. The building holds his ghost not literally but metaphorically, preserving in its workshops and salons the standards he established, maintaining through contemporary work the connection to traditions he inherited and transformed, ensuring that the Cartier name means what Louis intended it to mean even as the business itself evolves. Perhaps the truest legacy of Louis Cartier is not the mansion or the company or the designs that still influence luxury jewelry, but rather the demonstration that individual vision and relentless commitment can create value that endures beyond individual existence, that objects of beauty and excellence matter in ways that transcend commercial success, that dedicating life to perfecting craft rather than pursuing easier paths can produce meaning that death cannot erase. Whether such dedication justifies its costs remains a question that each person must answer individually. That depends on values and priorities and beliefs about what makes lives worth living. The house endures, patient witness to transformations that would astonish Louis Cartier, but would also perhaps confirm his faith that excellence creates permanence, that work done properly transcends its moment, that sacrifices made in pursuit of perfection yield dividends across generations. The mansion at 13 Rue de la Paix, where Louis lived and worked and suffered and died, where his designs were perfected and his health was ruined and his empire was built and his life was consumed, stands still, holding stories that luxury brand marketing prefers to simplify, remembering costs that success narratives prefer to forget, witnessing daily the continuation of work that began when a young man with talent and ambition decided that creating beauty mattered more than preserving himself. And if you ever find yourself in Paris, walking along Rue de la Paix toward Place Vendôme, where Napoleon's column rises against the sky, look for number 13 on the street's northern side, where limestone facade presents elegant restraint rather than ostentatious display, where discreet signage announces Cartier without needing to explain what that name means. Look through the windows if they are visible. Glimpse the salons where contemporary clients examine jewels created according to principles established by man who died before most current customers were born. See the continuation of craft that consumed its master's life. And if you know the story, if you understand what was sacrificed to build this empire, what costs were paid to establish this legacy, what price Louis Cartier accepted to ensure his name would endure, you might see beyond the luxury goods and corporate success to the human tragedy beneath, to the man who traded health for excellence and happiness for perfection and life for immortality, who built palace and made it his prison, who created legacy that survives him but couldn't save him from the suffering his dedication demanded. That is the dark story of the Cartier family estate, Louis Cartier's mansion.